Evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me. We are going to spend half an hour, 45 minutes talking about the upcoming European Accessibility Act of 2025. It's been a long time coming, and we're going to help you to understand whether you're going to be able to keep doing business with the EU after June 28th of this year. All right, that's when the Act comes into full effect across all EU member states. All right. So in the duration of this webinar tonight, we're going to look at understanding the basics of the Act. All right. What is the Act? What's the origins of the Act? How long has it been around? What is it designed to do? With particular focus on the digital side of things and the services side of things. Again, very much in the e-commerce space, which is where we spend most of our time. We'll then look at risks and opportunities for digital service providers. Okay, risks of not becoming compliant, not being conformant with the Act, and opportunities for suppliers that do become compliant with the Act within the given time frames. And then finally, for those that are not quite ready yet, they're not compliant or they're on a very tight timeline to get to that point for June 28th, we'll look at the steps that you can take to become compliant within a given time frame, or at the very least have a very good roadmap that is a good indication of how you intend to get there. All right, so thank you for joining, and let's dive in. Okay, so if we start to consider exactly what the European Accessibility Act is all about, with a particular focus on its digital impact. All right, so its origins, its purpose, and the timeline for its implementation, things we're going to discuss in a second. So the EAA, as we'll call it from this point forward, it was adopted in 2019. And the whole idea was, of course, to improve accessibility on a general level for anybody in the EU with some kind of impairment, some kind of disability, be that auditory, be that a motor impairment, be that a visual impairment, for example. All right. And really, it's about harmonizing requirements across all EU member states for the simple fact that until such a time as this Act comes into existence, each member state has its own rules and regulations, which makes it really quite complex and costly for businesses wanting to do business with those member states of the EU, having to comply with differing levels of accessibility requirements. Okay. So the focus for the EAA is on both digital and physical products and services. And really, as far as this webinar is concerned today, we're going to focus on the e-commerce side. Okay, so transactional websites, mobile apps, ebooks, banking services, e-commerce platforms are all in scope within the remit for the EAA. The core date, the one to be mindful of for everybody, is that businesses have got to be in compliance unless certain exemptions exist, which we'll talk about later, by June 28th this year, 2025. Really not too far away. Okay, there is the idea of a transition period, which we'll cover as well in certain situations. But really, it builds on top of existing standards, if you like, most notably the EN 301549. Okay, so that's a European technical standard. And of course, we're going to be drawing parallels here and explaining the relationship onto the WCAG standards as well, starting with 2.1, version 2.1, level AA. But ultimately, for everything, for the Act, it's as it should be. Anything we're doing with accessibility is around enhancing inclusion of everybody, giving same access to same services on a uniform platform. Economic participation. So, and it's important to add as well, this isn't services that are produced, provisioned, or have origin in the EU. It's selling into the EU. So regardless if you're from, if you're in the US or in the UK, but you want to do business and you want to sell software, for example, to member states in the EU, if you are not under the exemption rules, then you are going to have to subscribe and comply with this European Accessibility Act. All right, so it's about equal access for everybody. All right, and there's a URL if you want to get the actual act itself, as opposed to other versions of it. Of course, there are plenty that exist. That's the URL to go to. Okay. So talking about the history of it, as I say, it's been a long time coming, right? So by the time this is done and dusted, it's fully enshrined within law and everyone has to be compliant. We're talking about a 15-year period here. Okay, so the timeline is such that it was proposed in 2015 by the European Commission. By 2018, the European Parliament and Councils were in agreement on the content. 2019 saw three key events. That was the approval of the proposed act by the European Parliament, the adoption of it by the Council of the EU, and the publication in the official journal of the EU. So busy year in 2019 for movement through various checkpoints for this new act. In 2022, that was the deadline for EU member states to transpose this act into their own national laws. And now we come to 2025, June 28th, 2025, this year is the full implementation deadline, the compliance deadline for businesses. Okay. Now, 2030, so this is not so much talked about and maybe not so much understood, but there is an additional 5 years transition period for older products, older services, older software, stuff that is out there on the market. It already has a customer and an install base, but it's not currently compliant. So in that situation, there is a 5-year transition period by which, for people to continue using that software after 5 years, it will have to become compliant. All right, but by June 28th this year, software that's already out there on the market, for example, products and services software with a customer base, it doesn't need to retroactively be made compliant. All right, but we'll get into the weeds a little bit more in that. But if you hear this date of 2030, this is what it's in regard to. I began this by calling it a grace period, which does it a disservice, really, because what it is, it's a 5-year transition period whereby there will need to be, a multitude of companies in different countries getting their act together for this older software that they wish to continue servicing on the market, but it's going to have to be brought up to speed, and they have a 5-year window in which to do that. All right. But after 28th of June 2030, that window closes, and everything, everyone, every product, every service being sold into the EU will have to comply with the European Accessibility Act. Okay. Except for the case where there are some exemptions, and we'll come on to that shortly. So looking at this, the idea of a transition period, what is it? What's it for? So it's just designed to facilitate a path to compliance for companies with products and services that have been placed on the market. The phrase is placed on the market before June 28th. So as we said, if you've got products and services software that's already out there with a customer base, there is no requirement by June 28th of this year to make that retro compliant, if you like. All right, so let's just explore this. So the EAA applies to products and services placed on the market after June 28th, 2025. All right. So it's an interesting question here as well. It's the idea of customer base and new features. So existing software, existing customers, but new features versus a new sale. And that's the thing we're going to explore. Right. So if you are not a micro enterprise, and this is where the exemptions start, the idea of a micro enterprise, which we'll get into. If you're not a micro enterprise and your software or your product, your service existed on the market with a customer base before June 28th, 2025, you'd be forgiven for wondering if only new features after June 28th need to be compliant, or if the entire platform must be accessible for a new customer or a new sale after the deadline. And that's the key thing. All right, so you may have onboarded a customer on June 26th with your existing product, your existing service, your existing software. And there'll be no requirement other than 2030 for that software to be compliant. All right, that software, that sale, that instance will sail into the transition period. 3 days later, on June 29th, you make a sale of the same product, service, or software to a new customer. There is absolutely a requirement for that entire platform to be compliant, and that's the distinction here. All right, so even if let's talk digital services software, even if your software existed before the deadline, a new sale or license to a new customer counts as a quote-unquote new placement on the market. This is the terminology from the Act itself. This means the whole platform, not just new features, must comply for any customer who first buys or subscribes after June 28th, 2025. Okay? And all of this assumes that you are not subject to any exemptions, which we'll cover shortly. The transition period until 2030, so exactly 5 years, June 28th, 2030, only applies to existing customers or existing installs, existing users of your product or service or software. So if a customer already has your software before June 28th, they can continue using it without full compliance until 2030. However, new customers after June 28th do not get this transition period. They must receive a compliant product, read entire platform from the start. Okay. And then in either situation, so for the customer that signed up on June 26th or the customer that signed up on June 29th, in either of those situations, any new features and functionality added to your product or service must absolutely be compliant. So anything new going out post June 28th to existing and new customers alike has to be compliant. All right. Any features, modules, updates added after June 28th must be fully 2.1 AA or EN 301549 compliant, even for existing customers. So hopefully that gives you a bit of insight into what this transition period is designed to account for, but also the very clear situations in which it doesn't apply as well. Okay. All right. So moving on. Let's get right into the weeds of the Act itself. So if you're looking to get a copy of the Act, it's the commission.europa.eu site is where you want to go to. So when you Google that in your search results, this is the one you want to go to. A couple of thumbnails here or screenshots of that. So yes, this is the source of truth for the European Accessibility Act, if you like. What we see there as well is reference to the 301549. That's the technical standard, the harmonised European standard produced by ETSI, ETSI. You can see there that the title of that as a standard is the Accessibility Requirements for ICT Products and Services. On a slight tangent there, but most definitely related, off to the right-hand side there, we see a snippet from the gov.uk website. And of course, the reason for this is that the UK, having relatively recently left the EU, has its own spin on this as well. Okay, so on the gov.uk website, it refers to the there we go, sorry, the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations of 2018. All right, so in the UK there are another variety of standards of which this is one. All right, so the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations. But whether it's the 301549 or the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations in the UK, they both specifically point to WCAG 2.1 AA as the standard for web accessibility anyhow. So essentially saying the UK government is saying, well, if you comply with this Act, you'll be compliant with 301549. And what the EU is saying, if you are compliant with 301549, you will satisfy the conditions of the European Accessibility Act. So whilst the EAA doesn't specifically reference WCAG, it does indirectly through a reference to 301549. Okay. And in the top right of this screen here, what you're going to see if you're familiar at all with WCAG, what you can see there in section 47 is going to be very familiar to you. All right. So without explicitly referencing WCAG, point 47 of the opening article of the Act, if you like, talks about these 4 principles, right? So the 4 principles of accessibility of websites and mobile applications as used in yet another directive, the 2016-2102, are perceivability, operability, understandability, and robustness. Now, if you're at all familiar with WCAG, you will recognise those, of course, as the 4 kind of governing principles of web accessibility. So even though there's no explicit reference, we can see quite clearly within the Act itself, from the EU website, that it is absolutely referencing WCAG. And currently that is the 2.1 version of the standard to the AA level. All right, so that's the kind of the relationship between the 2 or 3 acts, if you like. Now, if we kind of dive in a little bit more, so EAA versus 301-549 versus WCAG. So quite simply, the simplest way of looking at this, the EAA is a law that tells you what you need to do, what's needed for compliance. And the 301-549 is a technical standards document that tells you how to do it. All right, so let's dig in a little bit there. So EAA is a law, more specifically an EU directive. It sets out accessibility requirements by way of a legal framework for products and services in the EU. It focuses on making sure that products and services are accessible to all people with disabilities and a variety of impairments, as we said, auditory, motor impairments, visual impairments, among others, of course. It covers a wide range of digital products and services, computer hardware, software, smartphones, ebooks, e-commerce applications, transactional applications, web applications, and banking services. All right, and we'll look at even more detail in just a second. The compliance deadline for this law, or this EAA, is June 28th, as we've said multiple times now. Okay, so the 301-549 in more detail then. A technical standard, all right? This is the recipe, if you like. This is how you become compliant, the things you need to do. Detailed specifications for making ICT products and services accessible, okay? It's already referenced by EU law as the standard, the de facto standard for accessibility compliance. Okay, so that's been around longer than the EAA has. Okay, and now the EAA refers to it. 301-549 was originally created to talk about public sector procurement of technology and making sure that that was accessible. Within 301-549, specifically in Chapter 9, it talks about WCAG 2.1 level AA. And there's a caveat to all of this, which makes it quite interesting. So there is a planned update to the 301-549 at some point this year. It's widely expected that it will be in the latter half of the year. Ironically, of course, which is going to miss that target date of June 28th this year. That planned version 4.1.1, whilst we don't know for sure what it's going to contain, it seems highly likely that it is going to up the ante to require compliance with WCAG 2.2. All right, now if you've watched any of our previous webinars, you'll know that the difference between 2.2 and 2.1, 2.2 has increased focus on motor impairments, and it actually introduced 9 additional success criteria. Not a huge amount, but 9 specifically, more around kind of motor impairments. But nonetheless, it's widely expected by accessibility experts in the industry that this update in the second half of the year to the 301-549 technical standards document is very likely to align with WCAG 2.2 AA. All right, so if we're thinking ahead and we're coming up with a roadmap of things to do on our products, our services, our applications, then why not just start aiming for 2.2 compliance from the get-go? It makes most sense. Okay. So, starting to look at who this affects then, right? Businesses, organizations, digital services providers. Okay. The page on the right, I'm not giving you the full page, of course, but by all means, go to the website, download the Act, and you'll be able to draw parallels with what you see here and what you see in the Act when you download it. We're looking here at Article 2 of the Act. That is the scope of the Act, and it's broadly split into two areas, which we'll look at in just a second. But I'm drawing your focus right now to Section 2, subsection F, I guess you call it, and that's specifically around e-commerce services. It's certainly where we spend most of our time and probably where most of our customers reside as well. Okay. So let's just explore that, right? So how is an e-commerce platform defined under the EAA? So the EAA explicitly includes e-commerce services within its scope. We've just seen that. And essentially, we're talking about online platforms that facilitate some kind of transaction, some kind of financial commitment, a financial transaction. So if you're one of those platforms or you provide one of those platforms, you're going to fall under the scope, under Article 2 of the EAA. Okay. E-commerce platform itself isn't explicitly explained or kind of gone into in detail. But you look at it, the definition in any other kind of European articles and documentation, it's clearly widely accepted that we're talking about an online service that enables consumers to purchase goods or services digitally. That's what we're talking about for e-commerce. Okay. So the EAA, again, this was what's different to 301-549. The EAA now applies to both private and public sector organisations. That's the fundamental difference. Okay. But with some exemptions for micro businesses. And again, make the point that this is the idea of selling into the EU. Now, you may originate, your product service may originate from the EU and sell within the EU, in which case it's going to apply. Equally, as I said earlier, it could originate from the US or the UK, or anywhere else outside of the EU, and still wish to sell into the EU, in which case it's going to be applicable as well. Okay. So there you go. It covers companies selling or providing digital services in the EU, even if they're based outside of Europe. As we've seen, we're talking about e-commerce, banking, telecoms, transport, software, media services. So a wide variety of service and product and service providers there. A huge change clearly is the fact that both for the target date of June 28th, but also on a regular audit basis after that, because this isn't a one-time deal, right? This is an initial compliance date, but then consistent adoption of the standards, and regular auditing to make sure, certainly on an annual basis, I would imagine, if not more often than that, every month, every few months, or every day in terms of the way we're going to advocate it later on. But that continual adoption, that continual expectation to be audited and to continue to be compliant with the Act. It's not a one-time audit and then done. You have a sticker and you're good to go forevermore. This is continual compliance, which means that design, development, and testing are all going to be impacted by this in a way that they, for some organisations, haven't been before. All right, design up front, shift left is now going to include, as it should do, of course, full consideration for accessibility. Development and testing are going to have to bring those skill sets into their team as well, to make sure that, as we've seen, any new feature, even on an existing platform that goes out on June 29th, is going to have to be compliant. So things that you are most likely developing right now, today, are going to have to be compliant on June 29th. All right. The impact of not doing this, non-compliance, is essentially around fines, of course, as you'd expect, market restrictions, issues with procurement, companies you wish to work with, all of a sudden that may become problematic. Reputational damage, that's going to be a bigger and bigger thing than it has been previously. And the thing to be very clear on here as well, this is an EU directive, but each EU member state is going to be responsible for enforcing it, policing it, reporting on it in its own way, within the guidelines as set out by the Act, of course. But each country will police it itself. This means that, if you're not compliant, you could find yourself in a few different sticky situations with different countries of the EU, with France, with Germany, all of the basis of one product or one service or one e-commerce web application. So again, it's not just a one-time audit. Every country within the EU is going to be responsible for looking at your product or service if you are trying to sell it into that member state. Okay. Then if we want to get really, really specific, we can go to Annex 1 and 2. So we've just looked at the Article 2, which is the scope, and then if you really want to get into the weeds, you go to Annex 1 and 2 towards the end of the Act. Okay, and again, it kind of follows a pattern, right? Annex 1 tells us the technical accessibility requirements in a roundabout way. I think some of these are probably still open to some interpretation. All right, they obviously can't get, that's why they refer to 301.549 as a technical standard, and that's why that then refers down onto WCAG 2.1. But it gives you a flavour here, right? So Annex 2 gives us, useful examples of most of these technical requirements. So I'm going to shout out to accessible.org website as the source of some of this information. Okay. So again, diving into e-commerce services now. Okay, so Annex 1 says things to think about, 3 key things: providing the information concerning the accessibility of your products and services being sold when this information is provided by a responsible economic operator. So I read that to be a kind of a statement of compliance. What is your roadmap for compliance, your current position, any gaps in compliance. They're all things that could be referenced on a statement of compliance that goes alongside your product or service. Number 2, ensuring the accessibility of the functionality for identification, security and payment when delivered as part of a service instead of a product, by making it perceivable, operable, understandable and robust. And straight away we see those 4 governing principles of WCAG once again within Annex 1 of the Act itself. So clearly referencing WCAG there. And talking about payment as well, so focusing on the transactional side of an e-commerce website, the financial transaction, the financial commitment. Okay, and then part number 3, providing identification methods, e-signatures and payment services, again, which are perceivable, operable, understandable and robust. All right, so it doesn't go into too much detail, but it tells you, the kind of top 3 things from e-commerce perspective that the Act itself is considering for compliance. Annex 2 then gives a little bit more information, not a great deal, but part 1 there. Ensuring that available information on the accessibility features of a product is not deleted, i.e. you keep talking about your ability to be compliant or how you are compliant or where you have potential gaps or recent regressions in compliance, bugs you've seen around your software, for example, that a week ago you were fully compliant, you've made a change and now you've introduced a break in compliance change maybe. But there's probably a somewhat of a grace period or an acceptance that you have a roadmap, a sprint plan that is going to deliver the fix for that most recent violation. All right. Part number 2, making the payment service user interface available by voice so that blind people can make online purchases independently. Okay, fairly clear. And then making the identification dialogues on a screen readable by screen readers so that blind people can use them. Okay, so it doesn't go into too much detail, but the idea is that Article 2 will define the scope of the Act, and then you have Annex 1 and 2, particularly with regards to e-commerce services, which then give you a little bit more information. But ultimately we then drill down to 301.549 and we then drill down to WCAG 2.1. Okay. So looking at the idea of exemptions now, there are some exemptions to the Act, but let's come back to the scope first of all, because there's a very clear distinction that's made between products and services. So we're looking at Article 2, we look at the scope, and Section 1 within the scope is applicable to products. Okay, the directive applies to the following: products placed on the market after 28th of June, services are then covered in Section 2. Okay. Without prejudice to Article 32, this directive applies to the following services. So there's a distinction made, understandably, between products and services. As we saw earlier, towards the bottom of Section 2, this is where we find e-commerce services. Okay, but when we come over to Article 4, we are introduced to the idea of a micro-enterprise and how they are actually going to be considered to be exempt from the EAA. Okay, so let's just explore that. So micro enterprises providing services. So as we've just seen, that's going to cover e-commerce services. That's in the services part 2 of the scope. Shall be exempt from complying with the accessibility requirements referred to in paragraph 3 of this article and any obligations related to the compliance with those requirements. Okay, well, why might that be? What is a micro enterprise and why might that be? Okay, well, we have our definition within the Act itself there to the bottom left. So a micro enterprise means an enterprise with fewer than 10 people and this is important, which has an annual turnover not exceeding 2 million euros or an annual balance sheet not exceeding 2 million euros. Okay. So why make that distinction? Well, it goes on to explain in chapter 70, right? Micro enterprises are distinguished from all other undertakings by their limited human resources, their annual turnover or annual balance sheet. The burden of complying with the accessibility requirements for micro enterprises, therefore, in general, takes a greater share of their financial and human resources than for other undertakings and is more likely to represent, and this is key, a disproportionate share of the costs. So we're essentially saying it's not especially achievable with a staff and a financial basis for some of these these smaller companies, okay, for reasons that it outlines clearly. However, it does go on to say, and that's the services side. 71 is specifically about products, which is interesting. And if you are in the product space, you're probably going to want to explore this further or certainly get a legal review of this. 71 says for micro enterprises dealing with products, so that's part 1 on the left of Article 2 scope. Falling within the scope of this directive, the requirements and obligations of this directive should be lighter in order to reduce the administrative burden. Now, I'm not here to tell you what lighter means. That certainly seems open to interpretation to me, but there you go. And then ultimately 72, it gives a kind of a closing chapter within here to say, okay, there are exemptions and for good reason, but 72, while some micro enterprises are exempted from the obligations of this directive, all micro enterprises should be encouraged to manufacture, import or distribute products and to provide services that comply with the accessibility requirements of this directive. So the pressure's going to be on, make no mistake, the pressure will still be on to be compliant. But you may be exempt from legal issues or fines. Now, I'm going to caveat that further in a second, but it does say in order to increase their competitiveness as well as their growth potential in the EU market effectively. And then it goes on to say member states themselves should therefore provide guidelines and tools to micro enterprises to facilitate the application of national measures transposing this directive. I.e., if you're trying to sell into France, you're trying to sell into Germany, the French and the Germans should be able to give their own guidelines on how you can, whilst you might be exempt, how you can be as close to being compliant with your products or services as possible in a way that's going to benefit your customers and in a way that's going to benefit you as well. Okay. So that's where the exemption currently lies. Now, I made a very clear point earlier, which was to emphasize the word "and" here. I've made a point at the bottom. As soon as you hire a 10th person or you exceed 2 million euros in revenue, you are no longer considered a micro enterprise and that exemption will no longer apply. Now, for most small companies, I would imagine that the hiring of a 10th person is probably the one of those two conditions that's going to occur first. And as I'm sure we all know, it doesn't take much before you need to hire a 10th person. So whilst the exemptions are there, it's probably quite easy and quite quickly to no longer be subject to those exemptions when it comes to the EAA. So just wrapping up in terms of requirements and legal obligations. So what's the Act for? What's it doing? Well, it's ensuring that companies provide digital services and products that are accessible following clear and agreed and signed up to technical standards. Without explicitly referencing WCAG, as we've seen, it clearly does focus on things being perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. It's obviously aligned with WCAG. We've said that it's already aligned with 2.1 AA through the 301.549 technical standard. And I'm willing to bet that by the end of the year that has changed to 2.2 AA with the 9 additional checks that are more typically focused on motor impairments. All right. Businesses have got to provide accessible customer support and feedback mechanisms. And as we just said, each EU country is responsible for enforcing compliance within its domain. All right. And that also includes the monitoring, the reporting, and the issuance of penalties as well. And this is why you can be subject to penalties in France and Germany and Spain, all right, for example. Okay, it's not a one-time slap on the wrist. So whilst some businesses can be exempt, everybody is, of course, encouraged, even if you are currently exempt, use the word currently there, to meet these accessibility standards for the benefit of all users and for the benefit to your company of opening up new market opportunities. Okay. Let's look at the consequences of non-compliance, but also the benefits of being accessible, of course. So the most obvious ones are going to be in the fines and the legal risk category. All right, there are lawsuits, penalties, legal actions with enforcement handled on a country by country or member state by member state basis. You may find yourself subject to market access restrictions if you're not compliant. All right, companies that fail to meet accessibility requirements may be blocked from offering services in the EU. And this is probably the panic button for many people right now, is thinking, okay, well, do I want to be able to sell into the EU after June 28th? And I need to sit up and take notice of this and have a plan to address it. Okay. Reputational damage, of course, so poor accessibility, as we've seen increasing numbers of case studies here, can be very, very negative publicity around some of that. Customer dissatisfaction, as we know, and exclusion of key user groups. We want inclusive products, services, and applications for all demographics. Of course we do. Looking for a wider customer reach. Well, being increasingly accessible is going to improve the experience for everybody. And that includes aging populations. And people often forget as well, WCAG or any accessibility, it's not just permanent impairment. It's also people with temporary impairments as well. Temporary vision loss, temporary motor impairments. And sometimes it's very easy to forget that sometimes if you're not careful. And then, some of the offshoot benefits, of course, of let's make sure we do it for the right reason, which is the customer base. But off the back of that, SEO and performance benefits, right? So search engines are typically going to favour accessible sites, good structured content, good navigation, fast loading pages, etc. And then innovation and competitive advantage. Okay, there's no two ways about it. Embracing accessibility as early as you can will allow you to have an edge in usability, compliance, brand trust, and the ability to innovate within that space. So we talked about some of the potential issues with non-compliance, if you like. But I think above all, the thing, if you're not compliant in a post-June 28th, post-EAA world, or moving into that transition period, the most likely and immediate challenges faced by non-compliant products and services companies, I believe, are going to be the ability to sell to companies in the EU. Not because of the legal side of it, but because of the fear from these companies of signing up with a company or a product that isn't compliant, right? So we're going to find that there is a legal obligation for buyers, all right, especially large enterprises, public sector. Their internal procedures, it's highly likely they're going to be required to only work with EAA compliant companies, right? Products and services. That may be one of the first questions you're asked in a procurement process. All right, so clearly an element of competitive disadvantage. So if you've got 3 of you bidding for the same business and 2 of your competitors can clearly demonstrate their compliance and you can't, you're probably not going to make it to round 2. All right. Long-term viability says that you need to be accessible. Your product, your service, your software needs to be accessible, and the sooner the better. So there's a high risk of procurement delays, rejections, internal compliance policies, despite the fact you may have done a hell of a pitch and you may have spoken to the right person, the person with the purse strings, but actually maybe the internal audit, the internal compliance that then stops that deal from going through. All right, your product, your service is essentially being disqualified despite having done all of the outstanding pitch work. So all of that work to no avail ultimately. So that's a very definite risk. And then the penalties and risks for the companies themselves, right? These companies within the EU that might consider buying from you. So there's a chance you're going to be seen as a potential higher risk vendor if your product and your service is not compliant. So again, there's probably going to be a lack of willingness because of that, this fear of buying from these higher risk vendors through lack of compliance. That in itself is likely to come up. And then business to business pressure. All right, so private companies that aren't directly covered by the EAA may still prefer EAA compliant vendors to ensure that their obligations are met, especially if they then go on to work within regulated sectors. So the legal side aside, if you like, I suspect that the place that you're most likely to run into trouble to start with is when actually engaging in conversation with some of these companies, when one of the first questions is going to be about accessibility compliance and what your current position is. And at that stage, you may make it no further. So that should be a compelling enough reason, of course, to have a plan to get to that stage, shall we say. So just moving on to accessibility of, we're going to focus on web apps now, okay, and mobile apps. That's kind of our bread and butter. But there'll be a number of these things that if you've done any kind of accessibility work at all, you will be very, very familiar with. Whenever we read about accessibility, these are the kind of things that tend to get spoken about the most. But of course, there's so much more than that. Okay, so we'll just draw some focus to the most common ones. So lack of keyboard navigation. If your users can't navigate your entire website in a way that makes sense without needing to use a mouse, you're going to fail against a number of WCAG success criteria. So you've got to have full keyboard operability. You've got to have focus indicators. So when you move around, you tab around the fields on a web application, it's quite clear where you are within the application. Poor contrast and text readability is probably the number one thing that gets spoken about the most. So low contrast text and images, making content difficult to read. All right, so... and again, I'm not making the distinction here of which of these which can be picked up by automated testing and which can be by manual testing. We all know, and we've spoken about many times on previous webinars, good and, in fact, the only way to have holistic and complete accessibility testing, it will always involve an element of manual testing. There are certain things that can only be checked manually with real world users, okay, and without automation tools. Automation tools, as always, can help you pick off those low hanging fruit, and they can allow you to embrace continuous accessibility testing, which we'll talk about in a second, but you're going to have to embrace manual as well. All right. Missing alt text, an obvious one there. Poor screen reader support. So many sites still not providing alternative text for images or structured content for screen readers. So that has to be taken care of. That's definitely going to be picked up with a variety of automation tools. Forms that are not clear and error messages that are not succinct enough. Okay, so forms lacking accessible labels, instructions, and informative error handling, making them very confusing for users. Solution there using ARIA attributes in the proper way with clear inline error messages. Okay, so these are going to be the things that most people are going to probably tackle first off, and the things that the violations they're going to find first off. If you've got content on your site, video, audio content, so the standard will talk about the auto playing of that content, the ability for users to have control, the need for captions, transcripts, audio descriptions, etc. So if you don't have video content, that's not going to apply to you, but of course if you do, then absolutely that's going to apply. And then inconsistent or unclear navigation. So bearing in mind that people may be navigating with keyboard only, so complex layouts, unpredictable page structures, which can make browsing difficult. You might find that you're navigating with a keyboard and you are jumping all over the place, from top left to bottom right to mid left to top right. That can happen. That is not a good experience for someone who's driving the navigation of that application with a keyboard and with a screen reader, of course. Right, so logical content order and intuitive navigation. So those are some of the common things. We're now going to take a look at some of the less well understood success criteria, what they really mean, and what you need to look out for when you're testing for them. So if we start to consider some of the lesser understood success criteria, we talk about accessibility, and so commonly we read about color contrast and keyboard navigation and text size and the ability to zoom and button layouts and all this good stuff. And yet that remains for most people the common perception of the majority of what accessibility is about. There's so much more to it, of course. And we're just going to draw attention to some of the ones that if you ask the average person in a delivery team with regards to accessibility, at face value probably have very little understanding of what some of these things are, and the importance to the accessibility standards which we're trying to be compliant with. All right, so without getting into too much detail, but just looking at some of them. So info and relationships, meaningful sequence, reflow, bypass blocks, multiple ways, motion actuation, error prevention. All right, so these are all, for the most part, I think these are probably sat within the AA standard, I think, certainly. And what you'll see, there's a pattern here with the majority of these. You'll find that they are probably unlikely to be detected with the use of automated accessibility auditing tools. These are good examples of things that really do need to be manually proven to ensure that you're compliant with 2.1 AA or 2.2 AA, for example. They can each impact different types of people with impairments, disabilities in different ways. Okay, info and relationships, we can see there that it's blind and visually impaired users that are perhaps most impacted from that. If we look at reflow, that's low vision users with a need to zoom in for readability, mobile users who rely on responsive design. If we look at bypass blocks, so bypass blocks, for example, this is the ability for someone, a keyboard only user without the mouse, being able to navigate your site, but moving from page to page, but without having or without being forced to excessively tab through repeating chunks of content, like a large scale header or navigation, for example, when all they want to do is get to the main content on the page. Right? So this idea that you can bypass blocks of functionality, you don't have to tab excessively. So more of a motor impairment thing. Okay, so again, that's not something that you're going to pick up with automation. Multiple ways, just making sure, again, this is for different type of impairment, people with cognitive disabilities, making sure, as it says, that there are different ways of achieving the same thing, finding content in more than one way, improving or adding flexible navigation to your site. Okay, so an e-commerce example here. Products should be accessible through search, through category menus, through breadcrumbs, and through sitemaps. 4 or 5 different ways there multiple ways of surfacing that information to the user. Motion actuation, this is kind of mobile or device specific. So what is it? Okay, well, ensuring that functions triggered by motion, so shaking, tilting, can also be performed using standard controls, and motion-based actions can be disabled if needed. Okay, so clearly device specific. It's aimed at users with motor impairments. Quite clearly something that you can't expect to test in an automated fashion. So these are just to draw attention to some of these other, just as critical success criteria, but things that people don't, not typically aware of when they first get involved with accessibility. All right, so just to draw attention to some of these as well. So preparing for compliance, thinking about next steps for business and developers, development teams. I think number one here, and it's not even written down actually, it's get a hold of the standard and sit down with your legal team and have a thorough review. And initially start by getting clear on what it means for your company, your product, your service, your software, assuming you want to continue selling it into the EU after June 28th. We've been through the majority of in simple terms here, how the Act applies, the idea of exemptions in certain company situations, the idea of products versus services, the idea of software that's already has a customer install, is out there in production prior to June 28th versus the transition period. So if you can get a handle on all of those, you're going to have a good grasp of what the Act entails. But nonetheless, sit down with your legal team and get clear on that. Next step is unquestionably to conduct an accessibility audit of your product or service. Again, now with focus on web applications, e-commerce and mobile apps. Start to embrace the use of some automation tools to help you with those quick wins. So tools like Test Evolve, Axe, Wave, Lighthouse, they can all help you with some quick wins from an accessibility point of view. And we just talked about the absolute need for manual testing as well for certain success criteria within the standard, especially within 2.2 if that's what you end up aiming for as well. There's which we're going to have a look at in a second. There's a drag and drop component within 2.2, which is new. You're going to have to test that manually, right? So. And above that, on top of your effort, engage with real world users, but not just real people that if you can engage with people that have some of these impairments, these disabilities as well. Okay, there are teams of people that of course are only too happy to get involved with this kind of work, for the greater good, as it should be, right? So try and establish a relationship with a team of people who can help you in this way. Okay, you'll have a very different perspective to someone else that is well founded on the use of screen readers, for example. Okay, you're going to have to look at your design approach. All right, a review and an update for your design systems, your approach to design, ensuring your UX, your UI design flow considers accessibility, those four main principles, from the earliest available opportunity. All the basic things we talked about: color, contrast, shape and size, text readability, interactive elements, everything we've talked about, clearly outlined in WCAG. But don't just make that something that the test team finds after the event. Shift it left now, right? Integrate accessibility as early as you can. Shift it left in terms of design. As part of your process with business owners, stakeholders, testers, and if it's not within the testing team or the development team, some accessibility SMEs at that design stage who can get the whole team thinking accessibility first. All right, let's not find it after the event and then have to kind of fit it later, as we say there. And then in your organization itself, look at the wider training of teams on what accessibility means. Most people have barely scratched the surface. It's a journey that you go on to become more and more aware of exactly how much is covered. What's included to be compliant, to be accessible. So that's all facets of your team: your product owners, your designers, developers, testers, content creators. It can be a great experience to get all of those people together to go on this collective educational journey to to get really and truly familiar with what accessibility really is. Okay, and then when you find issues, prioritize the fixing of those issues. WCAG compliance very handily gives you a score on things, severity, shall we say, whether it's critical, whether it's serious, whether it's moderate or minor. And like any other kind of bug, any violation, let's call these violations, address them in the right order. Address them in the order that's going to have the most positive impact to your user base when those things are no longer present in your software. And I think, having read and listened to lots now, I honestly believe that one of the most important things you can do from this moment forward is to document everything you are doing that shows your integrity as a company, your intent to honour the act and to meet that target date of June 28th. Best intent in adoption and a clear plan of implementation, but past that point, a vision, a company vision statement that says our products, services, and software is going to be subject to continual accessibility excellence from design, development, and testing. Okay. So just some more practical things now. We've talked about some of these, but start embracing automating testing. We've got tools like Axe, Lighthouse, TestEvolve, Tenon as an AI-based accessibility auditing engine. All right, use those as early as you can, as soon as you can, to start automatically detecting some violations on your application as well. You may need to consider slightly differing tool sets if you're looking at native apps, mobile apps versus web apps, but they're all out there. They can all be used. Okay. Manual testing, as we said, you've got to look at keyboard navigation, screen reader usage, NVDA, JAWS, VoiceOver, different operating systems. It's not good enough just to work on a Mac. There's Linux machines, there's Windows machines, of course, different mobile devices. They all need to be covered. Whether you then need to think about some kind of wider services like BrowserStack or Source Labs to actually get access to a wider range of devices, for example, that then may become a consideration. You look at your analytics, your user base, how are they using your application, which browsers, which operating systems, which devices. These all become factors in your strategy for accessibility testing. All right. Follow the WCAG framework, get familiar with it, get familiar with version 2.1, level AA to start with, and then with version 2.2, because if I were a gambling man, I would say that that's coming by the end of the year within the EN 301.549 update. All right, and then of course the EAA towards the end of the year, going into next year, 26, is going to be referring to 2.2. All right, so you may as well shoot for that now. And of course, going forward, stay up to date on these EAA and web content accessibility regulations as well. Okay. Just a quick look on 2.2. We've looked at this in the past, but the one I was referring to earlier is this dragging movements success criteria. So you need to be able to provide an alternative to dragging actions like touch gestures. Without being an expert in that particular success criteria, I believe the requirement is to provide an alternative motion, a single click option that would allow a user to achieve the same thing as a drag on one screen and a drop to another part of the screen. All right, so if you've already got things like that in your application, this is coming in 2.2. Couple of changes and enhancements to focus appearance. All right, so enhancing focus indicators visibility with stricter requirements, particularly in high contrast mode situations. Touch targets, the minimum target size has changed with version 2.2. That's now got to be 24 by 24 pixels minimum. And 2.2, I think for the first time, touches on accessible authentication as well. So this is invariably going to bring in things like capture to the conversation. So if you're using that on your application, you've got to consider whether there is your capture provider, if you like, can give you an accessible version. Sometimes they can, sometimes not. There are things you can do to not use capture, but effectively prevent spamming of your site, for example, which is what most people are using CAPTCHA for. There are other ways of achieving the same thing. In fact, the jury's probably out on whether CAPTCHA is even still the most useful way of trying to do that anyhow. All right, so these are the 9 additional things that come along in 2.2. That actually came about in October 2023, I believe. But almost certainly by the end of this year, the European Accessibility Act via 301549 is going to be including these additional 9 success criteria within the things that you are required to be compliant with. All right, as we see there is a bit of a focus more on cognitive and motor disabilities, more so than visual. But yeah, there you go. And so just to close out tonight, really, we mentioned it towards the beginning of the session, but this idea of starting to consider accessibility as a continuous part, a daily part, ideally, of your delivery process. If we're looking at web apps and mobile devices, we've already come to understand that the best approach is a combination of automated accessibility scanning coupled with manual accessibility testing. But this can't be a once-off event in line with the enforcement of the EAA on the 28th of June this year. The ideal approach is a continual commitment to adopt and to support the accessibility standards, and that means continual auditing of your products, your services, your applications. In this case, we come to think of it as being no different to functional regression testing. Every time we build code to a test environment, we do that functional regression testing. It's largely automated. We do exploratory testing with that as well. But agile testing says we do that every time we have a build of code to a particular environment. Accessibility testing should be no different. Ultimately, if we're continually making changes to the code base, sometimes in order to fix accessibility issues, other times to fix functional issues or introduce functional change, there's always going to be a risk of functional regression, but also regression from an accessibility perspective. Things that we've taken time to fix in the run-up to the 28th of June this year, come July, August, September, as we continually make changes to the application, could be at risk of regression from an accessibility point of view. So the only way to really safeguard about that is to embrace a continual testing and a continual accessibility auditing perspective as part of your delivery process. All right, so you can look at some of this kind of reporting from the TestEvolve toolset. So every time we have a build of code to an environment, we run a suite of, in this case, 3 automated tests. Each of those tests contains 34 checks, for example. And we can see on the most recent run that each of those scenarios with the 34 checks has recorded 11 critical issues. 2 of the runs didn't record any serious, but a run against a dark mode of an application did record 21 serious violations. Nothing on the moderate, and then a common theme of 11 minors. But this is something that's happening every day or with every build of code to the environment. And then that same level of reporting, if you're going to embrace this, needs to start educating you about the trend of your fixes, the success, the reduction in your failures over a period of time. And it becomes another metric that you can report on the success of to your senior management team, your stakeholders, and ultimately ensuring that your customers are going to be happy from an accessibility perspective. And of course, these types of reports, these automation tests, need to give you the lowest level of detail so that you can work with your developers to understand the issues, to drill down, to look at reference documentation if necessary, to understand the issue, to understand what the fix should be, to understand the types of users that are impacted with these violations should they make it to production. And ideally, you'll look at a tool that gives you that level of information, but allows you to do this on a very, very frequent basis. So with a tool set like TestEvolve Halo, you also have the option here to track your manual accessibility testing. This is what we call a guided run through, if you like. So you can set your standard, your level. So you can choose your 2.2 level AA, for example. And then you can manually walk through, expand the 4 governing principles of the WCAG standard, dig down inside of them, look at the guidelines, and then you see the individual success criteria. You'll be assisted in understanding what the issue is, what to look for. There's a place for you to make your notes, and ultimately you can pass or fail or skip or mark as not approved these individual success criteria in line with what you're experiencing on your own application. But it's an ideal situation if you can then start to bring all of your different types of testing together, one centralized reporting platform, share it with your delivery team, share it with your stakeholders. But coming back to the whole point of the EAA, just knowing that every day you have a very, very close watch on your current levels of accessibility, compliance, and an ability to diagnose quickly, to raise issues quickly, and as we said earlier, to prioritize the fix of new accessibility violations as quickly as you can in your upcoming sprints. Okay, well, that's going to wrap up our session for tonight. I hope that's been useful. I hope that that's given you a good introduction to exactly what the European Accessibility Act is all about. When it comes into force, what people's obligations are, whether or not you may be exempt currently, whether or not the transition period is going to be relevant to your organisation, your products and your services. And then starting to think a little bit more about actually not just 2.1 AA, maybe thinking a little further ahead for 2.2 AA. It's highly likely that the changes to EN 301549 start to stipulate that that becomes the new standard and the new level. So, why not aim for that right now? And then just getting you to think about really embracing or having a vision for your company, which is continual adoption of accessibility best practice, continual auditing, continual reporting on quality from an accessibility point of view, and then working with your delivery team to introduce those changes as quickly as you can, ensuring you have a well cared for customer base. So thank you for listening. If you're looking for a quick start with some either automated or manual accessibility testing, and this is new to you and you realize the importance of needing to do this by June this year, then do sign up. We offer a free, fully featured 30-day evaluation, and you could be up and running with automated accessibility testing in no time at all. We have plenty of other webinars that show you how to get started there. So until next time, thanks for listening, and good luck with your move towards compliance for the EAA June 2025. See you then.